Well, aloha, and thank you for joining us. I am Cunningham. Good afternoon, Hawaii. As a matter of fact, good afternoon to, well, anyone who's catching our Island News digital feed on this Election Day 2024, wherever you may be around the world. Now, polls here in Hawaii, they're set to remain open until 7 o'clock tonight, which is another 3+ hours away. And in case you missed it, there is also, well, this thing called a presidential race that we're going to be touching on throughout the night as well, especially since polls across the country have started closing or will be closing in the coming hours. Now, joining us live in studio is Dr. Jennifer Walsh. She is Provost and Senior Vice President of Strategic Initiatives and Chief Strategy Officer. This is at Hawaii Pacific University. If you don't mind, Dr. Walsh, as someone who has followed politics for years, you're feeling on Election Day. How are you feeling? Because it's an exciting time for an entire country.
It is. It's one of the best times of the year, to be honest. Even though we know how divisive our country has been, the fact that we all come together, a we the people system, and cast our votes and have confidence that this vote matters is really, truly remarkable. So that never gets old.
I was going to say, I feel the same way, and I've been a few more elections than you have. You know, for weeks, voters have had their ballots in hand. Now, I can attest there were a lot of cars that were in line on Punch Bowl this morning. They were pulling up to the drop-off lane for their ballots. It didn't stop some people also from waiting in line on Election Day. I know a lot of people feel that that's sort of their right. Did you see long lines at voting centers, especially Honolulu Hale? Were you surprised with our mail-in ballots that we saw such lines? And even just now, just a few minutes ago, we saw lines at Kapolei Hale, lines at Honolulu Hale. Surprised you a little bit?
A little bit. I mean, part of it's a byproduct of our consolidation of polling sites, so we don't have as many choices any longer with the mail-in vote. But people still like the sticker. They like the civic engagement of showing up on Election Day, casting their vote in person. I think there's also, confidence that they know when they show up in person, their vote will be counted. If it goes in the mail, sometimes you don't know, is it going to get there in time? But nonetheless, it's really exciting to see the enthusiasm among voters. Even when, in some cases, it seems like a foregone conclusion, the fact that people will spend the time and energy to show up on Election Day, to me just shows that our democracy is strong.
Strong, and you know what's really neat, too, over the years that I've covered a number of different elections, it's nice to see parents take children to do that, because you're kind of teaching them a very, very valuable lesson, are you not, as far as social responsibility?
Absolutely. We know that parents who do that, their socialization of students and future voters is really significant, and that will pay off in dividends coming in the coming years and election cycles.
Well, we talked about the mail-in ballot, and there you see just some of the line. Yesterday, we were reporting 314,000 ballots that have already been received. That's a lot when you compare it to just a couple of years ago. I think it's more apples to apples if you look back to 2020, because it's a presidential election race. That's probably a more accurate view when you try to compare, right?
Exactly. I mean, what we know is that voting by mail is becoming more and more common and acceptable. We recognize not everybody has the time to spend in line to cast their ballot in person, and this will probably be a trend that we can consider for the near future. I don't think anyone's eager to jump into internet polling or internet voting just yet, so by mail seems to be the most convenient option for people who really don't want to spend the day in line.
That is so true. A central collection, if you will, where the State Office of Elections is going to sort of be held up is down at the state capitol once again. Now, there are a number of different ballot drop boxes across the state. You can go to our website at KITV.com for the different locations. Voter centers, as you were talking about, have really changed the sort of landscape of voting, because I know for me, as a Makiki resident, it used to be Lincoln Elementary, and you probably had yours as well, right? Right. So those voter centers, the identification in the drop-off boxes, they're marked with an envelope. There has been some destruction of ballot boxes we've seen on the mainland, Washington State as well as Oregon. Now, we turn to the presidential race. Now, the 45th president back trying to secure a sort of second term in a non-traditional way after falling short in 2020. Now, his opponent is Vice President Kamala Harris. She jumped in the race a little bit late because President Joe Biden dropped out of that race. We see her here on the trail the last few days. Dr. Walsh, what do you make of the lone debate that her and former President Trump had between those two candidates. Your thought on that?
Yeah, so I think the stakes were very high for her. Some voters didn't really know her. It was an opportunity for her to present herself as a credible presidential candidate, and I think in that regard she was successful. Both candidates were light on policy. We're used to having quite a bit of a detailed conversation about what policies each president would champion if they were so elected, and both really seemed to emphasize character and personality over policy. That helped Harris because Trump's one big flaw, I think, is that his character is not necessarily what we would consider to be traditionally presidential. And so by presenting herself as a credible alternative, she was trying to introduce herself to people that she's really counting on today for their vote.
Yeah, and that's difficult to do. So let's talk a little bit about who's on the ticket with them. We have Ohio Senator J.D. Vance, who is on the ticket with President Trump, former President Trump, and then Governor Walsh, Tim Walsh of Minnesota, who's on the ballot with Kamala Harris. Do you think their debate? You talked about sort of old school and some of what we used to expect. Theirs seemed to be more traditional in nature.
It really was. In fact, a lot of the commentary afterwards was, can we have more of that, please? It was fewer fireworks than perhaps we expected, given that some of the rhetoric was sharper on the campaign trail. And predictably, they took swipes at each other's running mates, and that was not to be that was expected. I think because the vice presidential candidates themselves are fairly new to national politics. J.D. Vance was a relatively new senator coming out of Ohio. They don't have lengthy records to run on themselves. And so if you're not talking about policy and you don't have a lot of history to your own political legacy, then really you're talking about personality. And so it devolved somewhat predictably into those character attacks.
Now we're looking at a map, and we've seen some of those East Coast states now that are starting to get sort of returns. I know you've been holed up in the office watching some of these national returns. What about the states? What makes Pennsylvania, Georgia, Florida, some of those other states, what makes them so critical, so important? We've heard about them being swing states, and why are they so critical, those handful of 7 or 8 states?
Yeah, great question. Part of it comes down to party registration stats. So for the most part, people vote according to their partisan preferences. So if you're a registered Democrat, predictably, you're probably going to vote for the top ticket Democrat all the way down. Same with Republican. And for those states, we see almost even party IDs. The registration numbers are almost identical when you look at the percentages. But we also see Pennsylvania as one that's been tossed back and forth between parties over the last few election cycles. And polling data shows very, very few voters at this point still left an undecided category. So it's going to come down to who shows up today, who's waiting in line, who bothered to send their ballot in early, because with the electorate almost perfectly evenly divided, it's going to come down to a handful of voters in a couple of key counties.
Can I ask you this? We're seeing some of the lines on the mainland, very similar to what we've seen here at our different polling places. Has it surprised you, the sort of ramp up of security that we've seen in this election compared to elections past?
Yes, I would say the one thing that we have to keep in mind is that in addition to the candidates on the ballot, the process itself is what's being scrutinized by voters. We need to inspire confidence that our voting process is sound and has integrity. We need that for not only this election's results to be considered trustworthy, but also for the future, so that we know that when voters show up, they're going to be safe, they're going to be protected, and their vote ultimately will be counted as it's cast.
Has it surprised you early on? I know it's still very early, but has it surprised you? It seems like President Trump, I think the expected, at least the experts were, that he would kind of jump out early, or at least that's what it seemed like in the past few elections.
Yes, so we're watching the exit polling data very carefully. This is the questions that are asked as people leave the ballot box or as they leave their polling center. What we're seeing is that the economy is top of mind. That should actually help Trump. Unless they get into the specifics such as child care costs, elderly costs. Harris has come out with some early proposals to mitigate those if elected, and that may resonate with voters. But we're also seeing the state of democracy really at front and foremost for the voters themselves. that will work in Harris's favor, and it will ultimately decide who is still standing in line when those polls are closing.
I was going to say, and also just to let folks know, we're probably not going to have a winner by the end of this evening.
That's right. I mean, we would all love to know as we go to bed tonight here in Hawaii who the next president will be. It's probably going to be several days until we're definitively for sure.
It's interesting. We have all these mail-in ballots now, and it takes even longer than it used to take. So
That's
it's
right.
kind of a fascinating dichotomy that we have.
I don't know about you, but I have no more nails to bite. So we will be watching together.
I agree. Dr. Walsh, if you don't mind, you're going to stick with us throughout the evening. We
My
appreciate
pleasure.
that.
Yes,
yeah,
thank
we
you.
appreciate that. So here's what we've got planned for the rest of the night here on Island News. We have national coverage with ABC. It's going to be all the way up into our Island News at 6 o'clock tonight, and then another half hour of coverage starting at 6:30. Dr. Walsh and I are going to be rejoining you and at about 4:35 with another digital update, then another one at 5:35. And as always, you can check out the latest results online at any time at KITV.com.